Hey, good day, everyone. I am Josh Hearn, and I'm here joined with Jason Rankin. Today you are listening to and watching J&J DBA Insights podcast number 2. So today we're actually be talking about change management best practices for federal government agencies, human capital offices, new technology capabilities. But don't worry, this isn't just federal government. This is actually based upon the lack of federal government research. The study actually pretty much more looks at change management best practices and how do organizations or human HR or human capital offices within organizations implement the new technology capabilities, but not from an IT standpoint of view, but again more on thinking about the stakeholders that aren't IT. So let's say your teammate, your manager, but again, not your IT folks that are like, hey, here's this software, here's this laptop, or hey, here's this computer. So just go ahead and kind of just jump right into it. Um, so the approach that we're going to be taking today is an evidence-based management approach, and essentially what that is leveraging evidence to make management-based decisions, right? And the actual method that we're going to use to do this is something called a rapid evidence assessment. And there's a set of guidelines put out by the Center for Evidence-Based Management that kind of lists out those steps, and that's kind of the steps that we'll be going through here. When I say steps, think of like search strategy, or REA question, being rapid evidence assessment question. It's more of that transparency and rigor behind the research that you're doing. And we'll be looking at this from a theoretical lens of the
And
technology acceptance model. Oh yeah,
Josh,
Jason.
can I ask you a question there? So, I mean, you personally, do you have any? I mean, how does your personal?
So
Does it affect your
personally, I'm
work
a
scope a little
a
bit?
federal or government consultant. So I've definitely this is something that has come up a couple of times with different clients where they want to go in and they want to do predictive analytics, right? So we're going to do predictive analytics. That's
Right.
the new buzzword, right? That's the hot buzzword. But there hasn't been any other attention given to how they're actually going to implement this predictive analytics. So it's like, oh well, we need the software. And we might need someone with skills, but there's a whole entire back end process that goes with that. And specifically on this research, it's the change management practices that go into that. So how you can't just drop something on someone's lap and say go, but that's kind of how it tends to go. So again, I might have a little bit of bias in there as well. So I do want to call attention to that. But again, it's a gap that I've noticed in the research, though. Those folks that aren't IT. Again, so the folks that are actually potentially using the software, not the folks that are help stand it up. Um, and then also in this research, Cotter is kind of one of those big names that you hear in change management. So
Right.
I'm actually going to go back and take his 8-step model and see where and where not his steps are actually being addressed throughout the research that I look at. And I considered some other ad card that's more commercialized though, and then Lewin, who's considered probably potentially the one of the fathers of change management. But again, I picked Cotter because he's definitely well known in the arena. Um, so again, just kind of looking forward. In terms of the research question, kind of long-winded. We had mentioned it before, but what are the organizational change management practices that federal government human capital offices should consider that either support or inhibit the successful implementation of a new technology capability? And one of my colleagues pointed this out. I originally had best practices, right? And that's something you hear all the time: best practice
Right.
this, best
Right.
practice that. But what about almost the not best practices, or in this case, practices that inhibit, again, the successful implementation? And when we get to, discussing my findings, there was one that, I now push as an opportunity almost for, as opposed to a threat. But again, it was something that inhibited, but, Had you never brought it up, then people wouldn't think to look for it because they're only ever looking for best practice, right? So again,
Right. Yeah.
that's one that I turned into a best practice. But again, we'll get there down the road. So again, specifically federal government agencies, human capital offices. But again, with the research out there, you're able to generalize, this research to, I would say other commercial and private sector organizations. Intervention, again, Cotter's 8-step best practices to best practices and avoiding poor practices in alignment with Cotter. Mechanism, strategic thinking and planning before taking any action. So again, at the very beginning. And then the outcome is hopefully the successful implementation of the new technology capability.
Okay.
So again, starting at the beginning, after doing that initial literature background, literature, looking into the literature, and then also my literature review, kind of came up with this model again. So here in the middle in the white, you'll see perceived usefulness, perceived ease, attitude towards using technology, and intention to use. So this is TAM right here, and you see the legend down in the corner there.
Mm.
Then the blue boxes are actually CMO that we had just discussed kind of on the earlier page. And then at the bottom, you see Cotter. And I kind of propose that you'll see this happen over 3 phases, almost time phases. So first, you'll have this phase 1. Then once that's done, you'll have phase 2, right? And then once that's done, you'll have phase 3. So that's kind of how, based upon the literature and the background that I looked into with both TAM and Cotter, that's what I'd proposed. But again, that's going in. So obviously, there's definitely some changes once we get to
And
the final.
you can see where like Cotter's, like which steps of his are in which phase, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So again, the steps 1 through 4, it's kind of that, you're establishing, you're setting up, you're communicating that to stakeholders.
Right.
And then kind of in the middle, it's, where that action is taking place or beginning to take place. You're empowering your employees, kind of starting it up. And then phase 3 is kind of where you're on and moving, right? And you're trying to continuously, repeat those short-term wins, continue to produce that change, that continuous improvement. But again, I found some interesting things that we'll get to in the findings that kind of might, that kind of contradict what's proposed here. But we'll save that for a little bit down the road.
All right.
So again, looking at the method, again, we talked earlier about using the rapid evidence assessment, and that's something that can help determine if I want to go farther down the road into a full systematic review. But again, that's sometimes can be over a year of work. So with this, it's actually started with 139 articles. I had my search string, my inclusion exclusion, scholarly peer reviewed, and brought this down to 12 articles to be critically appraised. And we'll get into the critical appraisal here a little bit, kind of what that is and the purpose of it.
Did you use Prisma to weed them out?
Yeah. So it's actually, Prisma kind of helps, and you kind of see it here, but it guides you and it shows how, I got from these 139 articles.
Hey, this is still good.
Yep, down to the 68 and then down to the 55. So this chart is essentially what I use as my input to the Prisma chart. It processes better. But I have done a Prisma, and that's available, if anyone's interested in looking at it. So as I'm going through looking at these articles, though, getting down to this 12, 2 things kind of happen, right? Now that I've found these 12 articles for final final critical appraisal, I'm in there extracting data, and again, you can see on the screen author, title, year. Those are general. You'll see that, but one that is kind of out there is this level of trustworthiness, and that's my first assessment of the methodological quality of the articles. Right?
Is that how well it addresses your question or your review question, or?
It's actually more looking at the methods which is within each article itself. And here's an example. Actually, it's looking at to the weaknesses, right? So I'm in there, I'm looking at an article, and I'm like, wow, this is the sample is only taken from one country, right?
Right.
Or one company, and obviously, and that's in one country. And that's kind of like, well, can we really use that? And then it's like, oh, this was only, 25 people in a company of 10,000 people. And you
Right.
start having these questions. So again, that's something I'd mark down as a weakness and take a note on, and just something to come back later. And no, I don't have studies with, just 25, people out of a total of 10,000. But again, that is something that coming into the critical appraisal, which I use the MMAT tool, mixed method appraisal tool, that I also again dug a little bit deeper into looking at the quality of these articles, and essentially, using this tool allowed me to be more objective. Does it have XYZ? And it's either, a yes or a no. And actually there's two screening questions and then some follow-on questions depending on whether the study's mixed method, qualitative, or quantitative. And essentially I would answer the questions, and yes, I'd answer, does it meet this standard? Was the, along the lines of, is the, sample, or sampling adequate, for the study, and so it's a yes, no, unclear. And so again, then, the higher the yes scores, the higher the quality of that article. um so again, once I went through that process, the next step would actually be coding. And so went through first and second cycle coding based upon, the ideas and input of Saldana, and then did a thematic analysis, but then overlaid a framework analysis. And this is kind of where Cotter played in. So essentially, almost looking at like if you're in Excel and looking at a crosstab or something, I'd be like, all right, like, does this theme that I found, is that found in Cotter step 1, Cotter step 2, Cotter step 3?
Yeah.
And then that's kind of how I went in and looked for any gaps in terms of looking at Cotter's 8-step model. And then after, doing that coding process, obviously pull out your themes, turn into your findings. But then I also, leverage CIRQUAL to assess the overall confidence of those results. So actually getting into the findings, essentially came up with three major findings. And on the all the way on the left here, you can see the first cycle coding, then all the way to the right, and kind of how that waterfall down into these three different findings, which essentially change management best practices include minimizing employee uncertainty, which is that one that I talked about earlier, inhibiting, essentially this idea of, you're not going to have successful change management practices and thus the successful implementation of this technology if you don't focus on the fact that employees are concerned about the uncertainty of this new technology. So that's where that inhibit played in. And then more of those supporting is managing employees' expectations, ensuring communication, and fostering a culture of support for the change. And this support for the change, this is, think in terms of like training, right? Because
Yeah.
you've got, usually you're going to, oh, employees, here you go. Just, a lot of times it's here you go. But what the research really showed was that having this culture of support, both in terms of leadership support, but then again that training and that development, that we're not just going to stick you with this new technology and expect you to know it, right? Like, we're here to support this transition. Kind of the second finding was this strategic planning, and the inclusion of the change management in that strategic planning, both at the organizational and team levels. And again, this is something that needs to be done prior to the implementation. So you need to have the strategic plan, and need to have the change management component, kind of looking back to that first, the first change management best practices, and that first thing. You need to have that all integrated. And it could be obviously a working document or, a working plan, but you need to have thought of that, before you jump into this implementation.
Right.
Again, otherwise
How
you're
did this
not going to have the
affect
buy-in.
how did this affect your final conceptual framework?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and move on to that here. I believe it's coming up here quick.
Oh, okay.
Real last finding, though. Again, there are gaps in the research. I had mentioned Cotter, but I can actually show you that when we get into this, this final conceptual model here. So again,
Right.
before, I had it broken out, thinking that, hey, Cotter is going to fall into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3.
Oh,
Well, I actually found out that there were, I believe it was step 6 and 7 for Cotter. They were more focused on that, continuous change management, like continuous, like generating short-term wins, and kind of this keep winning, that wasn't present in the research. And now, a recommendation that I'll get to later, but it's essentially, is it me and my process and the REA process that I went through, was it possibly my search string, or is that just not existent in the research? So again, that's something I recommend in the future looking into. Is that an actual gap, or is it again, almost, is an issue with the researcher's approach? But also here, you can see in the gray box is adding in this organizational and team level when you're looking at doing the strategic planning in phase 1, and then the change management practices themselves, again looking early on at the beginning before you start the implementation of, minimizing the uncertainty, managing the expectations, communicating, and this culture of support.
Now, is
um
TAM all in phase 2 now? It looks like it's been separated.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
again, so breaking it out, looking at the research, it was essentially phase 2. Obviously it doesn't happen all at once, but you have
Right.
employees think, right, and then they have they have this attitude towards if they're going to use the technology or not. And then, at that point they're kind of deciding if they want to or want to not use the technology.
Mm,
And then you move into this, that moves into phase 3. If they decide to use the technology, this moves into successful implementation.
right.
So again, that's kind of how, looking at the research, how it was broken out in there, and so it's kind of how it came to fall out, at this point in my final conceptual model. um Again, I had, kind of, it had, falling out of the, I'd shown that coding slide and kind of the 3 different findings. It kind
Right.
of essentially fell out real nice, right? Though, develop a change management plan, right? Focus, this is recommendations for management. Focus on all levels of the organization, so organization, team, and individual. Incorporate those best practices that you had shown, I had shown in that first finding. And again, that's key. And then develop the strategic plan that incorporates, the continuous change management and that culture of support. um
Well, okay, going through your process. Oh, well, I mean, I'm sorry, you can go on to limitations, but going through the process, I was wondering, how did the peer reviews of your manuscript help or hinder the
yeah.
process?
So I had 2 different peer reviewers, and again they went through and they had essentially set a criteria they were looking at when doing the peer review. But essentially they're looking for if there's any gaps essentially in my logic, both, well, in my logic, and then also just, sentences that may or may not have made sense, some general cleanup.
Right.
And again, there was definitely some feedback that I incorporated, in terms of potentially, one example was, in my data extraction table, and my colleagues was like, I can't understand, like, when you're marking out the years of your articles, it just doesn't make sense. So again, that's something I went back and fixed, and again made it more clear, in my manuscript, is, that graphic there kind of showing those years. But then there are other points where, I was like, some, colleague, I did give them, comments based upon their feedback, and I was like, hey, um I think I'm gonna leave this the way it is, and here's why. Someone, I think,
Yeah,
one of my colleagues.
it's important to actually, be able to defend why you're doing it, and that's kind of why your view from putting the report in, or the rapid evidence assessment together. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it definitely made me think more, though. I had to sit, like you said, I sit there and defend, because I just
Right.
don't want to write back and be like, no, like I wanted to be like, no, but here's why.
Well, it's a good
So
process to develop as we all go along,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
In
yeah,
defense of our
exactly.
future research. So yeah. Last limitations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the REA process in general, it's quick, it's rapid, it's supposed to be, it's supposed to tell you, hey, do I need to look into this more? But again, for this one, 11 weeks, which obviously then, limited the amount of articles that could be looked at. And again, single researcher, rapid evidence assessments are actually usually done, with more than one researcher, I believe.
Yeah.
But in this case, it was just me, and so we talked about research bias a little bit earlier. So that's definitely a concern. But the peer reviews definitely helped. And another one I want to call attention to is the again this lack of government research. I
Is
just
it
want to
hard
be
to find government research?
it is, and something I talk about, in a paper is actually the Evidence Act of 2018, and it's essentially saying, hey, the government needs to be better in tracking and using evidence, essentially. And so what's having to happen now is essentially use the terms called transferability generalization. So like, can you essentially transfer the findings of one study and generalize it to another? And that's something that, again, I'm proposing in my paper. Probably gonna have to propose in my dissertation, and it's fine. Looking back at the research and what's done, as long as I state as long as I'm essentially transparent and rigor, and essentially provide my rationale from for that, then it's fine. But if I don't disclose that, that I'm not using, government research, then that's the problem. But
Uh,
it's also up to the reader of my article. If I then state that, hey, I'm using, this transferability generalization, but you as the reader then have to take that and take it as you will. But again, if there's no research out there in the federal government, or a lack of research, then we have to start somewhere, right? And
right.
that's actually somewhere I want to continue down the road, is helping tie, over the next, over my career, is kind of helping close that gap. Large gap, but you got to start somewhere, right?
Definitely.
And again, Jason, we kind of went through this, so I just wanted to, thank you for your time. It's just glad kind of being able to kind of talk through some of this. I know sometimes you do presentations and whatnot, but we don't have the chance to interact back and forth, until the very end. And
Right.
it's questions, and then you jump back and trying. So again, I enjoy definitely having the interaction back and forth. So yeah, with that, I just like to thank everyone for their time.
All right. We'll see you guys in the next installment of J&J DBA Insights. Have a good one.